Live and direct from Kunstmuseum, Liechtenstein, it's TEDxVaduz 2013. Radically open.
Hi, I'm an economist, and today I'm going to present a study that I did with prisoners. Worldwide, there are more than 10 million people living in prisons, and the US are leading the statistics with more than 700 inmates per 100,000 inhabitants. And if one looks at only men aged 18 or older, the statistics look even more dramatic. So in the US, all men, 1 out of 54 men aged 18 or older are actually living in prison. And this trend is reinforced by the fact that for many inmates, prison doors are revolving. So it's estimated that 4 out of 10 inmates that are released will be rearrested within 3 years. So this creates substantial economic costs. So for example, in 2007, for every $10 that were spent on higher education, $6 were spent on correctional facilities by the US government. The scientific discussion is quite controversial on the impact of imprisonment on subsequent criminal activity. So on one hand, there's the economic theory of crime that was developed by Nobel laureate Gary Becker, which suggests that crime is the result of a cost-benefit analysis. So people weight the expected benefits against the potential costs that they face from this crime. On the other hand, there are also theories from sociology and criminology that suggest that prisons actually hardens inmates, so it creates a criminal identity in them, which then is assumed to promote further criminal activity. So prisonization theory, for example, argues that imprisonment places people in a very unique social environment, the so-called society of captives, which has its own legal code or own informal code of conduct with norms and values that are often antithetical to the society outside of prisons. Now, exposure to this special culture can lead to the internalization of these norms and this culture, and therefore promotes a criminal identity in those prisoners. Now, there is in fact good evidence showing that people imprisonment strengthens criminal attitudes and criminal identity in criminals. And in fact, it appears that this happens pretty fast. So most of the identity change happens within the first couple of months of incarceration. However, the crucial but still untested question is whether criminal identity actually leads to more rule-violating behavior. And in the following couple of minutes, I'm going to present you a study I conducted which tests this question. But how should identities influence behavior? So the two economists, George Akerlof and Rachel Crandall, developed recently an economic theory of how identity influences behavior. The key assumption in their model is that people have different social identities, like your race, your gender, your identity as a professional, your identity as a family member, etc. And each of these identities is tied to a specific set of norms that prescribe how you should behave in a specific situation. Now, which norm or identities actually dominate in a situation depends on the context, so on the cues that are prevailing in the specific situation. So, for example, while you are at work, your professional identity is more salient, and therefore you behave more according to norms that are prescribed by your professional identity. And the opposite is true while you're at home. Your identity as a family member is more salient, and you behave more according to the norms or how you were expected to behave as a family member. Now, if we apply this in our context, we assume that prisoners hold a criminal identity and a moral identity. The moral identity prescribes honest and law-abiding behavior, and the criminal identity prescribes delinquent behavior. Now, if we increase, or if the criminal identity is made more salient, we should therefore observe more crime or more delinquent behavior. In order to test this conjecture, I conducted, together with my colleague Alan Cohn and Thomas Noll, an experiment in a maximum security prison, namely the prison Perchuis, which is Switzerland's largest prison for male adults. We were able to recruit 182 inmates for our experiment, which have a quite broad criminal background. So around 30% of them are in for violent crime, 26% are in for drug-related crime, followed by property crime and sexual crime. And 2/3 of them are repeat offenders. Now, these inmates received an envelope that contained a survey with questions about life satisfaction or subjective well-being and standard demographics. And towards the end of this survey, we embedded 6 questions that comprised our main experimental manipulation. So they were presented 2 different versions of this survey. So 50% of the inmates were asked 6 questions about their criminal backgrounds. So since when are you in prison? For what reason have you been in prison? And is this your first imprisonment, etc.? So the purpose of this question was to remind the prisoners of the fact that they are incarcerated criminals, and therefore to move their criminal identity top of their minds. The other 50% answered questions that were unrelated to their criminal background, like mostly questions about their TV and radio consumption habits. So the only difference between the 2 conditions were these 6 questions that reminded them of the fact that they are incarcerated criminals. Now, following this survey, they had to open a second envelope that contained 10 coins that were worth about 55 US cents each. And they were instructed to flip each of those coins and to report the outcome on paper. So for every coin flip that ended up heads, they could keep it and put it into their pocket. For every coin flip that ended up tails, they had to return it back into the envelope, seal it, and hand it over to the guards in the next morning. So as you can see, the prisoners had a clear incentive to cheat and misreport the outcome of their coin flips. Moreover, because they were unobserved and alone in their cells, they did not have to fear any negative consequences from cheating, because we were not able to say whether a single individual cheated or not. But what we were able to do is to detect cheating on a group level, because we know the distribution that should result if everyone would be telling the truth. And this is how the distribution should look like. So we could expect that most of the inmates, 25% of the inmates report 5 times heads. And the more we deviate from 5, from this outcome 5, the less likely the outcome is. So for example, the outcome 10 times head should be observed in less than 1% of the cases. So how did the prisoners behave in this experiment? As you can see, they were a little bit too lucky. So as you can see, the distribution is clearly shifted towards higher number of heads. You can see what stands out is the number 10. Around 13% of the prisoners reported to have flipped 10 times heads, even though we would expect less than 1% of the prisoners to do so. But prisoners do not only cheat up to the maximum amount, so there are also some incomplete cheaters. You can see that the outcomes 7 and 8 are also clearly over-reported. Now the question is, how did our treatment manipulation influence cheating among those prisoners? So here you see the percentage of heads that were reported by the prisoners in the control condition, and it's around 60%, which is significantly above the 50% we would expect if everyone would be telling the truth. Now, if you remind them of the fact that they are criminals, they cheat more. Subjects in the criminal identity condition reported heads in 66% of the cases. Now, we can use simple probability theory to estimate the number of misreported coin flips in this task. And this amounts to 20% in the control condition and 32% in the criminal identity condition. So reminding criminals of the fact that prisoners of the fact that they are criminals triggers more dishonest behavior among them. Now, you might say, or you might wonder whether this measure, this experimental measure of this coin-tossing task, is a meaningful measure of rule-violating behavior. And we were lucky to get access to administrative records of in-prison misconduct. So we had the number of disciplinary offenses from each of those inmates. And these offenses are things like aggression against guards or other inmates, or illegal drug or weapon possession, and other kinds of illegal activities. And now what we do is we take this information and to test whether there is a correlation between our experimental measure of cheating and this rule-violating behavior in prison. And in fact, we find a significant correlation between those two measures. So if, for example, people who report 5 times heads have on average 2 disciplinary offenses since incarceration. Now, people who report 10 times heads, the number of offenses is more than twice as high. So we have 4.2 offenses on average in the group of those prisoners. So this suggests that our experimental measure is a valid measure of rule-violating behavior. So overall, the results suggest that criminal identity is an important factor in rule-violating behavior. However, at this point, I also want to emphasize that these results do not speak against the effectiveness of prisons in general, because it's known that prisons have incapacitating effects for habitual and dangerous criminals, and also the mere fact of the threat of imprisonment can actually deter criminal activity in the first place. However, I believe that these results should be taken into consideration by legal practitioners and also by policymakers. So, for example, one should gear the organization of everyday life in prison and also therapy programs in such a way that they prevent inmates from adopting a criminal identity in prison. So this could, for example, be achieved by increasing the interaction with community volunteers or regular citizens, which provides them with alternative social identities that are more conducive to law-abiding behavior. Moreover, the results suggest that we should rethink the potential side effects that specific legal practices have on criminal identity. So, for instance, many convictions come along with collateral consequences, such as the loss of civil rights, like the right to vote, or the loss of professional licenses, etc. And this type of collateral consequences actually further strengthen social exclusion, and therefore also could create or strengthen the criminal identity. And finally, I think that our result that social identities influence ethical behavior applies more broadly than just to prisoners. In fact, we have conducted a recent study with bankers, and we were able to show that reminding bankers of their professional identity actually triggers more dishonest behavior among them. Thank you very much.